Okay, we're going to get things underway. I'd like to welcome everybody and thank everybody for joining us today for this launch of the Net Zero Provincial Report Card and discussion of how provinces can drive the race to a zero carbon economy. Provinces matter, and they matter a lot in Canada in particular, due to the peculiarities of our constitution. One of the board members of Corporate Knights was discussing this with earlier today, who used to run policy for the Premier of Ontario, estimates that a province that really wants to can drive 85% of the solutions necessary for a zero carbon economy, whereas a province who really wants to put the brakes on can stop about 85% of the solutions for the low carbon economy. And that's where we're talking about power systems, which have interprovincial aspects as well, whether we're talking about transport systems, as we see in Quebec and BC with their zero emissions vehicles mandates, or we're talking about building codes or regulations of industry and beyond. So provinces and resources, of course, provinces matter a lot, and they can on their own drive solutions or on their own stop solutions. And so when Shawn McCarthy, who has been a long-time journalist covering energy and climate, approached us and we had this discussion about launching a net zero report card for the provinces, it was an easy decision. And Shawn, as many of you will know who are joining us today, one of the most insightful, incisive journalists covering this kind throughout his career as a journalist, and now in his career where he writes for Corporate Knights and does other work as well. Really led the charge on doing the analysis to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, across the Federation. And we're really honored to have with us Minister Iriving from Nova Scotia, which is the top ranked province. And I think that's notable for a couple of reasons. The most important, though, is Nova Scotia was not born on third base in the low carbon sweepstakes. It's a coal province, and it's making the transition to go towards zero net carbon. And really proud that our recently hired Director of Research, Ralph Torrey, has been working closely in developing the decarbonization plan with Nova Scotia in his work before joining Corporate Knights full time. So we're really happy to have you with us, Minister Irving. Also happy to have with us Shannon Phillips, who is finance critic in Alberta and MLA, former Minister of Environment and Climate Change, who led the charge on Alberta's low carbon policy initiatives for 4 years when she was minister, and will have an interesting vantage point given Alberta's having receded in the league tables on this topic and being such an important province for this to be gotten right. Of course, we have with us some other experts, Dale Begwin with Institute of Climate Choices, who has done extraordinary work looking at what policies are necessary for net zero economy, one of the leading economists in North America on this topic. Really looking forward to his insights. And of course, Bruce Laurie, who's been helping to shape Canada's low carbon policy context for decades now, and has some interesting vantage points on the critical role for provinces on the path forward to a zero carbon economy. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Bruce for some table setting remarks, and then Shawn will get things underway. So thanks again, and looking forward to the discussion. Bruce?
Great, thanks so much, Toby, and thanks for all your work on this, Toby. Corporate Knights has done a fantastic job, and you personally have really been leading much of this. And congratulations also to Minister Irving and Nova Scotia's leadership on this. Super exciting. Hard not to love everything going on in Nova Scotia is my view of the world. So just in terms of just brief comments, Toby, and I think your context is really important, just the extent to which provinces can either impede or accelerate the actions that we need to get us to net zero by 2050. And I guess the one point that I'm just going to try to drive home here today is it's also the provinces working together. And I think we sort of think of the provinces as their own thing, and we think of the federal government as their own thing. But the way the Canadian Constitution typically works is that once you build the capabilities and the leadership within several provinces, and it doesn't matter necessarily which provinces, you usually need a couple of the big ones, but say, you've got Quebec, Manitoba, and BC on board for something, or you've got Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Alberta on board for something. you can often get the kind of change that you need just by showing that those provinces, the political leadership, and the population in those provinces is behind the kind of change that we need. And we're doing a lot of work right now looking at, and as are you, Toby, looking at how we need to electrify Canada. Basically, the electrification of end-use energy is fundamental to achieving our 2050 goals. And yet we have a very a segregated, disaggregated, you could say almost parochial approach to electricity system management in this country. And we really need to get over that. The provinces need to be coordinating. They need to be not just in terms of building physical transmission, infrastructure and interties, but in actually rethinking the markets, the opportunities, the trade, the facilitation of coordinated, interconnected electricity systems that I think will ultimately create more reliable, more cost-effective, and get us to more cost-effective carbon reductions and get us to net zero faster. So just one illustration of provinces working together being really critical. And I'm going to leave it there and look forward to hearing from the other speakers. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to thank Toby for the invitation to do this and for the support in doing the analysis in the magazine. And I don't want to go through it. There's a lot there, and I invite you to if you haven't already, have a read of it. But just a couple of high-level thoughts around it, and then we'll get into the panel. One is clearly from the map, not all provinces are created equal when it comes to this carbon intensity, reliance on the fossil fuel industry, and so we have to look at what provinces can do. How do we measure? And when Canada is committed to a net zero journey, how do the provinces do their fair share? Most of the provinces have at least indicated a commitment to get to net zero themselves. 3 have not. Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have not made that commitment. But an aspirational commitment and having plans clearly are 2 different things. So while it might seem like that's a sharp distinction, it's less sharp than it appears on paper. If you don't have the plans and policies to back up that commitment, then you're maybe closer to the ones who don't have a commitment than you are to the leaders. The leaders, we looked at Nova Scotia, Quebec, and BC, and they all have robust plans and policies in place. We actually, and congratulations to Minister Iriving, most of the research was done just as they were taking office really over the winter, and it was really exciting to see them step forward. And Nova Scotia was already in a good place, and they've turbocharged it. So congratulations. Quebec and BC both have strong programs in place. Both have holes as well. Both can do more. And it's important when we saw the International Energy Agency report from yesterday about what it's going to take to get to net zero by 2050. The task is enormous, unprecedented. You run out of adjectives for it to describe the challenge that all economies face, and certainly one like Canada, where we have our regional differences and a heavy reliance in some regions on fossil fuels. The laggards were Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and not just because in the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they tend to rely more. Don't be fooled by those bars. That's a starting place as to where those provinces are. But that doesn't necessitate lack of ambition. And we have Shannon Phillips here, who was a member of the new Democratic Party government in Alberta that brought in fairly ambitious climate plans. It was a huge first step. Again, more work needed to be done, but it was certainly put the province on a different path. And so, you know, where you are doesn't necessarily mean where you need to end up. One last comment on the provinces that I refer to as laggards. All of them have made commitments one way or another to. There was good work by the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, Dale's organization, on getting to net zero, and one of I think a really useful framing of it were the safe bets and the wild cards. And the safe bets are policies and programs that we can undertake now that the technology is ready to go, and we can make huge progress to 2030 interim targets on the road to net zero. The wild cards are bigger technologies, bigger bets: hydrogen, carbon capture, some of the nature-based solutions, direct air capture, that aren't quite ready for prime time in a lot of cases, but could deliver huge benefits. And these provinces, small modular reactors might be one of them. These provinces have made commitments in those areas. But the point being that you can't let the commitment on the wild cards stop progress on the safe bets. It's incredibly important to make that short to medium term progress. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel, and let me lead off with you, Minister Iriving, Keith. As I say, the Institute for Climate Choices made some useful distinctions between the safe bets, the short-term things that we can all do, and the wild cards that might deliver really strong benefits down the road, payoffs down the road. In Nova Scotia, how would you characterize that effort? Where are your safe bets? Where are the wild cards that could really be game changers, and how do you balance out the effort? And before you kick in, let me remind the other panelists. So we want to have a conversation here, and so when the minister finishes up, please, Shannon, Dale, feel free to jump in and join the conversation. Over to you, Minister.
Great. Thank you very much, Shawn, and thank you for Corporate Knights for hosting us. I'm not even in this position for 100 days and have been asked to take the accolades for an A grading here. But I really need to share that with Nova Scotians and really share it with the previous governments, because we've been at this really since about 2007, when we brought in a piece of legislation called the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act. And I think that has been key as we've moved forward through PC, then an NDP, and now Liberal government for the last 8 years in terms of the work that we've been doing. I want to thank the CICC for framing this discussion on the pathway to net zero. And it's, you know, as you have mentioned, it's really the diversity of Canada that really shows us that one size does not fit all provinces, and each province is going to have to approach the issues that we're facing with greenhouse gas emissions based on their regional mix of energy and the environment that they live in. In Nova Scotia, we've been focusing on cleaning our electricity sector, and we're one of the few provinces that continue on coal. And so for us, we need to get off coal. Our new premier has made a commitment to move that target date from 2040 back to 2030. Most recently setting a new target of 80% renewable energy for our electricity system by 2030. And we're en route to that thanks to, Muskrat Falls, which will come online in a big way in the next 12 months or so. It's been delayed, as most people know. But the work of that got started 8 years ago. That will help us reach 60%, and we're looking now at wind to get us to 80%. And so both of those I would classify as safe bets, and a big part of our steps moving forward. With respect to wildcards, now, small provinces have far fewer financial resources to really support the realization of these wildcards. And so similarly, we need to move more cautiously about planning for wildcards in terms of contributing to meeting our targets. But that said, we still have the opportunity to support research. We've got 10 universities here. And we've also worked at creating an innovation ecosystem for business, because the solutions for wildcards are not going to come from governments. It's going to come from the private sector. And so the role of government is really to set those conditions so that businesses can help us realize those wildcards. And a good example in Nova Scotia is the support that we've been able to provide for a company called Carbon Cure out of Dartmouth that has found a way to put carbon into concrete, and they're really leaders in that front, and it shows that even in a small corner of Canada, we can take innovation and support that work towards the wildcards. Another wild card that we have been working on for a decade or so in our backyard is obviously tidal energy. This has been a challenge. I live just on the Bay of Fundy here, and those tides have created challenges for us to realize that dream, but we continue to provide support for those companies that want to test tidal energy in the highest tides in the world. So these are important areas in which our Premier has spoken to the opportunity with respect to the economic opportunity as we transition to a zero carbon world, and supporting businesses that are going to help us solve these world problems. So that's in some respects, having no or very little energy created here, the opportunities to create energy at home with renewables becomes a real economic driver. So that becomes a part of the discussion here in this province. So the balance of investments will likely be very different for different provinces, depending on their size, their natural assets, and their particular energy mix. But again, for the short-term targets, for us putting into legislation targets that help keep the momentum going, safe bets are where we have to rely and underpin our legislative targets.
Shannon, could you address it from Alberta's situation, and then maybe Dale, you could wrap up the safe bet wildcard with a pan-Canadian view?
Well, I take a bit of a similar view as Minister does around wildcards, and there's a couple of reasons why. I've thought a lot about this mix between, what kind of policy that the provincial government wants to put in place, and it's helpful to kind of go back to the original. The reason why provinces exist was to deliver services and essentially regulate what gets dug up or cut down. Right. And in the original formulation of this, when Canada was created, this was sort of the boring stuff, right? Healthcare, education, timber allocations, crown minerals. And it's become considerably less boring over time. But it is helpful, I think, to go back to, what a provincial government is for. in this case, which is to set some of the tax and regulatory structure around digging it up out of the ground or cutting it down, and ensure that you've got appropriate level of service delivery. Of course, we understand services as much more than just healthcare, education, and social services now. We understand that as post-secondary and training and even into R&D and innovation policy and those kinds of things. But when we get back to basics then of what a provincial government is for, you are setting some industrial policy. So you're finding the right mix of tax and regulatory in order to achieve a particular public policy outcome. So in as much as you're doing that, you're trying to find, I believe, the most boring ways, or you should be, to bend the river so that the private sector can fish in it, to Minister's point about, we set the conditions, right? I think when a provincial government oversteps that and tries to get into those wild cards, what you end up with is what I call the monorail risk, right? You end up with, I'm going to fund this thing and I'm going to spend a whole bunch of money on it, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to demonstrate to the public what it expects of a provincial government, which is action right now on something, right? A healthcare and education system, the things that voters expect us to do. And I'm not necessarily going to demonstrate to voters that I've got a whole bunch of jobs created from something, which goes to your political permission structure. I'm not necessarily going to show voters, if I look at those wild cards and to the almost exclusion of everything else, that climate policy can work for them. This is an area that people have been recipients of 30 years worth of messages that there are only costs, there are no opportunities. You're not going to see more jobs from this. If you're a voter listening to these messages, you hear transition. Well, you don't really hear the just transition part. All you hear is essentially, transition to EI. My job's obsolete, right? And so if you have governments focused on those, especially provincial governments, it's too big a project for what a provincial government should be doing. It is not correctly sized, I don't think, to the political expectations and the political reality. And then finally, from a pure, market-based policy making point of view, it doesn't do what you want firms to do in terms of what you can actually accomplish through the appropriate mix of carbon taxes, industrial pricing schemes, output-based allocations, and whatever you're going to do on the economy-wide side to actually be able to push innovation, right? Because you're taking that off of the big firms' plate. You're saying, okay, we're kicking the can down the road. We'll find some moonshot thing for you later. We'll take that responsibility away from you. And never mind, you don't need to invest in R&D and innovation and be disruptive like firms that have actually created value for their shareholders, like tech firms and others over the years. You don't need to worry about that, right? And so it takes that responsibility off them. The other thing that it misunderstands is, I think, even in an oil sands producing jurisdiction like Alberta, Saskatchewan, where a good chunk of your emissions profile still lies, even within that context, is within transportation and buildings, where it's not wild card stuff. It's super boring, unsexy things like efficiency and insulation and what the Boilermakers are doing with their time, right? So it doesn't send the right market signals, as well as being politically problematic.
Good. So what then is the role for wildcards, Dale? And Shannon made a point about whether it's a provincial role at all. So if you could address that.
Yeah, my co-panelists know their stuff. So they've said, I think, all the right things. I mean, there's a difference between 2030 and 2050 that is worth articulating here. That when we're talking about 2030 targets across the country, then it is the safe bets. It is the boring stuff that matters most. And in those cases, it's the familiar policy instruments driving those fairly boring solutions. It is economy-wide carbon pricing. It is regulatory policy. It is building codes. It is the more familiar policy instruments that are well litigated but also pretty well established, both at provincial and federal levels. The wildcards matter most in the long term, in the 2050 story. And our analysis shows that, yeah, you can get to net zero with very few wildcards, but it sure is easier and it sure is more prosperous if a few of those wildcards start to pay off. But I think this takes us into policy territory that we are collectively less comfortable. I mean, yes, carbon pricing and the expectations of future carbon prices is going to drive some innovation and might unlock some of those wildcards. But there's some other questions here about how public investment might be useful to place some careful bets. And again, that's in addition to safe bet policy, not instead of, to maybe unlock some of those opportunities. What's interesting, and we'll come again to this, I'm sure, today, is that every province is so different in its context and so different in its opportunities. So it's interesting to me that the possible wildcards that might pay off aren't the same in Alberta. They aren't the same in Nova Scotia. They aren't the same in the North. So those differences is part of this Canadian federalist landscape that is at the essence of our climate policy conversation.
So let me just ask one more question on this before we move on, because Bruce raised in his remarks the idea that rather than provinces working alone or even alone and with the federal government, provinces need to work together. And on some of these bigger bets, hydrogen, small nuclear reactors, even CCS, it would seem that these aren't policies where provinces where we would make the most gains by provinces working on their own, and yet we have a series of provincial strategies around a lot of these things. So anybody who wants to jump in, and where do we get provincial cooperation on some of these things?
I can jump in, Shawn, just quickly on that. I think, you a couple examples. I mentioned cooperation across electricity systems. Hydrogen is also a very good example. There are certain parts of the country where we will see the manufacturing of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Other parts of the country will see the actual fuel cells being made. Other parts, it might be Alberta, for example, is very well positioned to be a North American leader in the production and distribution and storage of hydrogen, given all of their assets. Alberta probably will start with hydrogen from natural gas. Quebec will be looking at electrolysis to produce hydrogen. But all of that needs to be, there needs to be a national strategy, not a federal government strategy, but a national strategy among provinces and businesses with the right kind of investment to build out these, hydrogen nodes across the country. And the electric vehicle supply chain, another perfect example. Critical to the economy of Ontario, but also lots of other participants across the country. So my view is I couldn't stress more the need for this kind of interprovincial cooperation.
Very good. So you can keep an eye on the chat too, because people are making points in the chat as well as we go along. But I want to shift to an issue that I think is, I won't say uniquely Canadian, but it certainly is a big issue for Canada, and that is how do we partnership with Indigenous people in this country and among and provinces. What's the role of the province in dealing with the Indigenous population to further the innovation, to further the adoption of technologies, to learn from their knowledge, to et cetera. We tend to see the Indigenous relationship as essentially federal, and so Shannon, you had a role there, and I know that was an issue that you paid attention to. So why don't you kick that off?
Well, I know I just went on an extended, Shansplanation about how provinces should stick to their knitting in terms of their jurisdiction. This is one area where I believe that, when we signed treaty, we did so as all of us, big crown, little crown, as I always refer to the provincial government. And so there's responsibilities there, and this constant, just kicking people back and forth of you're somebody else's responsibility is the actual root of the problem here, or one of the big roots of the problem. So we should not do that, because that essentially what the end of the day result is that we're abrogating our treaty responsibilities. And that's unconstitutional, therefore unlawful, and we shouldn't do it. And so, but the way I look at a lot of these things, and the way that we structure climate plan as well, is, you know, it's not Indigenous like consultation, right? As the, you know, because our constitution like kind of drives us into, you know, consultation for Section 35,
Yes.
right? To me, I took it as, you know, okay, Little Crown is responsible for doing, so we're just going to do in the same way as we're, you know, we're just going to focus on that action piece, right? So yes, around land use decisions and all that, we have these constitutional responsibilities for how we're going to, you know, dig things up or cut things down, as I was talking about. But there's a whole realm of doing that I think provincial governments ignore with respect to Indigenous peoples at their peril. So we did, for example, when we did our renewable energy procurement, which was, you know, effectively an auction, right, in a contract for difference way, we did our second round after we sort of proved out the concept for bringing in the new renewables onto the grid in a market way. We built in an Indigenous equity requirement for the second round, and everyone went around, you know, worrying and clutching of pearls and about how much more expensive it would be. You know, there was this underlying idea that, you know, that somehow, you know, the business level sophistication of Indigenous corporations would drive up the price, which there's a coded problem with that, right? Turned out that round was actually lower price than the round that we did at the same time that didn't call for the Indigenous equity component. So, you know, proving out that concept by doing. The other way we did it was through even just using our own government procurement, right? So instead of just saying, I'm going to procure, we had some contracts that were up, some PPAs, like for GOA power. So instead of just going to the market and saying, you know, re-upping our existing wind contract or otherwise, because it was the Klein government that procured everything by renewables for the GOA in the mid 2000s, true story. So we went back out and said, okay, we're going to do a solar procurement, but we're not just going to do that. We're going to require Indigenous equity participation. And sure, and I said to the solar guys, you know, if you guys can't bring me a decent price, then I'll just go with wind and we'll get on our merry way, right? So you need to compete. This is not, you know, just line up at the government trough. And they did, and they brought us a price that was very, very competitive with a Northern Alberta oil sands region, Métis local as the equity partner. Right. So, you know, like, let's not talk about the, you know, the engagement so much as we talk about the doing. This is to say nothing about, you know, of the efficiency and training and other programs that we funded using economy-wide carbon levy money. I just think there's a lot of ways that you can use the powers that you have to really do real change. And provinces shirk that both at their peril in terms of their long-term equity outcomes, but also they're just completely blind then to the way the world's capital is looking for opportunities in these areas, because the ES&G are important to people now.
Right. Mr. Keith, how is Nova Scotia approaching the partnership with Indigenous people on the clean energy agenda?
Yeah, I think we're rooted in the same way that Shannon has spoken about it. We, in the last number of years, have really built a much stronger relationship with the Mi'kmaq peoples of Nova Scotia. And underpinning that is a statement that our former premier used many times, is we are all treaty people. And so we have now embarked much more in partnership with Mi'kmaq in terms of projects and in terms of energy projects. They are coming to the table with projects that are receiving federal and provincial funds, and there are reserves in Nova Scotia that are entirely self-sufficient in their own energy needs now. And in some ways, they're leading the province because of their interest in this and their, let's say, more philosophical approach to how we are working with our planet. And you know, I think we can continue to learn from First Nations peoples across this country in terms of their relationship with the land. I spent 20 years in the Arctic, and that's where I first really saw that connection to the land from an insight into that cultural perspective that we miss as colonialists. And I think that shift is happening, which I think is key. And I think their embracing of the climate change agenda is a testament to the importance of that relationship with the planet that I think now more Canadians are beginning to understand how important that is.
And I think if we can advance the solutions around remote communities in particular, not all are remote, but for those communities that are remote and off the grid, if we can advance solutions there, that's something that we might even be able to take to the world, because there's one of the pressing issues is solving climate while you're also making affordable, reliable energy available to all those people who don't have it.
Shawn, could I jump in on that one really quickly?
Yeah, please, Dale.
I mean, it circles back to your previous question in interesting ways, where you looked for examples of cooperation across orders of government. And the Pan-Canadian framework really stands out as this collaborative effort between provinces and territories and the federal government, and really a landmark way of moving that federalism conversation forward. Yet interestingly, it's been criticized increasingly for the way in which it included indigenous governments and indigenous perspectives. And that's an interesting piece of the puzzle that complicates the story even more. But I think if we're serious about reconciliation, it's one that has to be part of our federalist climate policy story as well.
Right, very good. So let me move on. One of the issues that arose as I went through the research on provinces and some of the criticisms even of some of the leading provinces was that we need greater transparency, greater accountability in terms of not just enunciate. You know, we have on the one hand we have policies and programs, and on the other hand we have targets, but often we don't have a clear path for how those policies and programs lead us to the targets. So, Minister, what is Nova Scotia planning in that regard? I mean, the federal government has introduced and is now working through Parliament on a climate legislation that will lay out interim targets post 2030 and have a whole bunch of accountability mechanisms in it. What is Nova Scotia planning?
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. And I alluded to this earlier in terms of our work began with the EGSPA legislation that was brought in 2007. And that had quite a number of goals in it that carried forward through 3 different governments led by different parties. And each government put their thrusts on a certain piece of that. We're now revisiting that now with, I guess, the international, national, provincial awareness of the importance of climate change, and are stepping up our game as we have, as I've mentioned, in terms of increasing our targets. So we brought in a Sustainable Goals Act about a year ago, and we are embarking on the consultation that will bring forward regulations that put more targets beyond our main target of greenhouse gas reductions of 53% in 2030 and net zero by 2050. And included in that legislation is the duty to report on a yearly basis. I think it is so critical that provincial governments try to put these goals in the laws of the province to keep that accountable, so that when government shifts, because climate change is so important, we can't allow ourselves to remain vulnerable for the 4-year electoral cycle, to be stopping and starting every 4 years. We have to maintain that momentum. So I think the importance of trying to get targets into legislation, in regulations, so that if changes are needed to be made, and hopefully they are positive changes and becoming more ambitious, that you return to the legislature. But certainly it makes it far more difficult for a government change to shift priorities away from this important initiative that has to be at the forefront of all governments throughout the planet.
Thank you. Shannon, is that something that I know there were pieces of that in Alberta with the NDP government, but I don't think there was correct me if I'm wrong, a full legislative plan that got you from A to Z. So is that even? I always felt, to be honest, that it was just not something that people were ready for in Alberta, was to be explicit about where you were headed. But you will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, this business of targets was something that, you know, the media's favorite sport when I was a minister was to, you know, surround me with people yelling the word target, you know, until I was, the 15 minutes had elapsed and I left. But maybe you were one of them, Shawn, I don't know. You know, my answer to that was always like, the way I thought about it anyway was, you know, going into this thing in 2015 when there, you know, the emissions trajectory was projected to go away, you know, up, was let's do first pants, then shoes. So let's get the policies in place that might actually reduce emissions in the short term, understanding that targets are a nationally determined contribution to an international conversation, and that any of us reaching them is going to require the feds occupying their jurisdiction, in particular their spending power around this, which, you know, I'll remind us all that in the spring of 2015 was not there. You know, and taking that leadership, whether it's, you know, on those near-term reductions like we talked about, whether it's some of the regulatory and policy pieces, the spending power pieces, the tax policy, or any of the either compliance or voluntary markets that might be contemplated to get to there. Because at the end of the day, you know, Alberta committing itself to a target also disproportionately then, I would argue, takes the hit in our economy, right? So that because, you know, the fact of the matter is that 60 odd tons per person, or you know, like the fact is that, you know, that is weighted to Albertans so that people in the Lower Mainland, you know, can drive out to the hike in Squamish on the weekend and pat themselves back on the back that they have a fifth of the emissions intensity per capita, right? Like it doesn't take into account that wells to wheels kind of thing, which is where you take into you have transportation, buildings, those things that are also, there's a big role for federal policy there, right? So I always took the view that, look, you know, my line of work is not, you know, a 30-year time horizon. We are not the People's Republic of China. We have to do things in the short term that are democratically understandable to people, and so we have a level of accountability there. So let's focus on things that will demonstrate that the policy works, that puts people to work in ways that the voters are looking for in terms of economic diversification and leveraging existing strengths. So I got quite, you know, I would push back on you guys, Shawn, with this constant targets, where I would just be like, well, what are we doing? Are we discussing how we can balance, you know, angels on the head of a pin, or are we putting in place the right tax and regulatory instruments to actually reduce emissions and put people to work?
Okay, and I do remember you pushing back a few times. Dale, you mentioned in the chat that the Institute has weighed in on this issue.
Yeah, climate policy wonks like metaphors. So they talk about carrots and sticks and regulations and pricing and subsidies. But this piece of work that I alluded to in the chat is about another tool. It's about flashlights. It's about shining some light on progress and trying to bridge that gap that Shannon's talking about aspirations that we fail to deliver by not implementing sufficiently stringent policies to actually do so, and try to square that circle a little bit through transparency, through reporting, through regular checking in on progress and stock taking. And that matters federally for sure when we have federal targets and federal commitments to international policies. But I would argue that it matters provincially and territorially as well, especially because the provinces and territories are active. They are assuming some leadership in implementing provincial and territorial policies. They want to co-own, in lots of cases, things like carbon pricing or equivalent regulations. They're looking to drive autonomy from federal policy in order to tailor to their own local context and local priorities, which is fair and federalism in a nutshell. But it also then raises this question of, okay, how do all the pieces add up? And one way of shining some light on how those puzzle pieces fit together or don't to add up reductions province by province and territory by territory to overall national emission reductions is this kind of tool, this kind of accountability framework that does require this transparency and does report on progress to push towards cohesion and ultimately towards progress.
Right, and clearly targets are a challenge for a province as they are for a federal government in the same way. I mean, you have so much jurisdiction and it's shared, and if you're a province with fairly ambitious goals, but you have a federal government that's not supportive, then your chances of meeting your targets are greatly diminished, and we know that. And Toby alluded earlier to the opposite effect, which is the federal government that doesn't have supportive provinces and has difficulty making targets. We're going to move to questions that came up from the audience. I've been making some notes, and Toby has sent me some of your questions. But let me finish off with one that I had thought about before we got into the audience, and Shannon alluded to it. So I think it is worth exploring just a little bit, and that is, how do we measure? You know, we make comparisons. I made comparisons in this report. We make comparisons among provinces in terms of targets they have and so on. We know from the starting point that a ton of emission, or at least getting to a certain target, is way more expensive for one province than it is for another. So how do we assess the ambition of a province when we look at the all-in picture? Keith, would you touch on that? Because, as you said, Nova Scotia was a coal province and is still.
Yeah, we're a coal province. I mean, I think that's a difficult question to answer, particularly from one province's perspective. I think that's where the national view of the country needs to take some leadership in terms of dealing with the different challenge that Alberta faces versus Nova Scotia. I think we need to, as a province, work with the problems that are in front of us. In terms of us, it's coal primarily generating most of our electricity at this point in time, and work with the strengths that we have and work towards the lowest hanging fruit that we can work on in the short term. But it's really, I think, the federal government that has that perspective on how Nova Scotia's path and its targets and its ambitions align to meet that federal goal. The federal goal now 40-45%. Nova Scotia has said we can do 53. I think your report says we can do 56. So we're going to carry a little bit more water in our small way as a small province. But I think the trying to evaluate provinces to province is best done from the federal level than for me to try and pass any kind of judgment on the goals of Alberta.
Shannon, I mean, you touched on this, so you spoke to it. So, but if you would like to add to it, maybe briefly.
Well, you know, I know I just spent some time saying, you know, I pushed back on the target conversation, but it is absolutely true that business runs on targets, and so too do you know, targets mean that we are measuring, and then we've got a unit of value, right? And so I think what we end up doing in the climate conversation is we subsume it over into, you know, the sort of the environment department or that kind of thing. But actually, if we've got a unit of value, that is to say a ton out of the atmosphere is now, it costs something to put it in there. So taking it out is also an economic benefit. Rightfully, a lot of this measuring, reporting, verification resides, I believe, or should, within departments of finance. And there's a role for our securities commissions as well. And there's a role for provincial governments, expertise, and so on, and a role for the federal government in standardizing and rationalizing at weighted intensity of production, compliance markets, voluntary markets, and Canada's eventual participation in Article 6 of the Council of the Paris Agreement, right, which is the trading across border of credits. And so that piece, you know, you can't have those markets without measuring and reporting. That is to say, something that will feed into an eventual target. You can't even have articulate a net zero policy without that. So I don't want to dismiss entirely that piece of it. What I want to do, though, is sort of separate in our minds the sort of higher level political conversation divorced from how we're going to get there from the how we get there piece of it, which is a far more long form than 140 characters kind of conversation.
Right. Dale, in the net zero report, I don't think you dealt with sort of carbon budget per province, and you hear that sometimes from advocates of a net zero pathway. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, this question of effort sharing has kind of been the third rail of climate policy in Canada for a long time. And in a way, the pan-Canadian framework skirted the issue with an economist answer. It said, set a common price of carbon, scale it up to the level required to hit the national target, and let each province contribute emissions reductions that make economic sense at that price of carbon.
Right.
That's a sort of elegant solution. Interestingly, in our net zero pathway, Shawn, we didn't publish this, but we do have provincial results that we've been kind of playing around with. And different provinces contribute very different levels of emissions reductions. And in fact, net zero for Canada doesn't imply net zero for each province. Some are going to cost effectively do more, some might do less. And who does more or less is actually counterintuitive. In some of those scenarios, Alberta is going net negative, drawing on its deep advantages for geological storage. So where negative emissions become viable, Alberta's got an advantage and it can therefore do even more at lower cost. The question then is who's going to pay for it? Who's going to facilitate those questions? That raises Shannon's questions about trading and transfers.
Very good. And just a word of explanation for the audience there. Dale's talking about the carbon capture and possibly even capture from the air. Alberta is particularly well situated to sequester carbon in the ground and store it. And as carbon prices go up and regulations get tighter, there's going to be theoretically a business case for capturing carbon and storing it, and possibly even doing so on a merchant basis around the world and generating credits. Bruce, did you want to weigh in on this burden sharing question?
No, I think I'm going to skip that one.
Just wanted to give you an opportunity. So a couple of the questions that came up, and for you, Minister, talk about an ambitious climate policy, but Nova Scotia is still looking for offshore oil and gas development, and has supported LNG export from Nova Scotia. We saw from the IEA report yesterday the suggestion that there should be no new fields, not new investment, but new fields developed in oil and gas, and that we really need to ratchet back a lot of investment in the fossil fuel sector. So is that a consistent message that we got coming from Nova Scotia?
Thank you. The position right now of the government is that in terms of the Paraday LNG plant, it's a project that received approval in 2014 in terms of an environmental assessment, and so it's moving through its process. It's still questionable about whether it's economic. We will evaluate that if there's supposed to be a decision on that project by the company in June, and at that time we'll evaluate that. Our cap and trade program right now is designed and structured to be enforced from 2019 to 2022, and so we are in the process of evaluating that, and then designing a new system and figuring out our carbon pricing that can accommodate any new projects that we foresee.
Okay. Last one to you as we run out of time, Shannon, and just to put you on the spot, because I always did enjoy that. Not that you ever had any trouble with any of the questions. But what are NDP plans now for if there is, I think you do have an election coming up in a year. If NDP, is it not a year or 2 years? If
it's supposed to be 23.
23. Return to power, what would an NDP climate policy look like? And recognizing you're now the finance critic, not the environment critic.
Well, like I said, you can't have an economic policy without understanding how global capital is looking for a home in electrification and various other decarbonization strategies, and moving from combustible to durables in some way, shape, or form for existing extraction, and decarbonizing the extraction process for energy companies. So when they talk about no new fossil fuel investment, I always look at that and go, okay, that does not mean no new investment in durables. That does not mean no new investment in decarbonization, taking carbon out of the barrel. That does not mean no new investment in energy, right? It's a certain type of and reason for fossil fuel extraction that we have to do, and we understand that, right? We are undertaking a bit of as an NDP opposition caucus, an effort called Alberta's Future, talking to people and in an iterative process around some of these sort of confluence of energy, finance, economic development questions. Because things are moving so quickly. So we are supposed to be, making an offer to the electorate in the spring of 23. It might come earlier, you never know. But I would not have told you in 2013 that an appropriate offer to the electorate in 15 was coal phase out by 2030. And then even in 2017, when we did it, I wouldn't have told you that it would be done by 23 and not 2030, right? Things are moving so quickly that I think that what we, as we do this, I think what we need to do is go, okay, here are the specific commitments that we can make, that we understand, the sort of safe bets, if you will: efficiency, transportation, clean tech, methane, these ways that we can put people to work in a very quick way. Hydrogen, as was discussed in the chat, absolutely, both of the blue and green variety. I think that we can contribute there. I also think that policy, climate policy, is at its most effective when it is sector specific. We talk a lot about these economy-wide prices, all very well and good, has its own politics, believe me, I know. But our best achievements were around sector-specific strategies, whether it was methane or the first or second largest single reduction of pollution in Canadian history was the Ontario and the Alberta coal phase outs, right? And so those are major reductions to Alberta's emissions profile. And it was with a sector specific strategy of both regulation and tax policy that achieved that. Right. So I think we're going to have to look for I'm a fan of sector specific strategies rather than, dropping one market based approach and just walking away and calling it a day. I don't think you're going to get to where you want to go with that.
All right. Well, thanks very much. And thanks to all the panelists for a lively discussion. We could be here all day and solving the world's problems, but over to you, Toby.
Thanks, Shawn, and thanks, Minister Irving and Shannon. Maybe we'll have an honorific back on your name. Like you said, who knows what the future holds. And then we're looking forward for this to really spur the race to zero. And we'll be posting a full recording, edited recording of this in the coming days. And looking forward to tracking the provincial progress going forward. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And thanks, Shawn, for doing a great job on the moderation. And have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Stay safe out there.